when people say the Treaty of Versailles is part of the reason for Hitler's rise to power, people don't call you a Hitler sympathizer, right?
Right.
That's just standard, like, historiography.
They might have at the time.
They might have at the time, but like now they don't.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Djene Bajalan is back on the channel after the purge. Djene,
The Great Purge.
Yeah.
I'm doing good. How are you doing, Doug?
I'm doing okay. I like your brick wall, but the blur is good as well, I suppose. I have
what do you have
tarp
in the
behind me,
background?
just a black tarp to cover up the mess of my room.
That's very professional. I've just blurred the background to my office. So
yeah. So you and I, Djene, are both sinners. We've both we're heretics. I think we've both gone to the dark side because we both have published in Compact.
That's true.
Magazine.
We're now fascists.
Yeah, the piece that you wrote is called "The Poverty of Anti-Imperialism," and I wrote some screed against the contemporary left. In your essay, let's just jump in here, shall we?
Sure.
You wrote that in maintaining this Manichaean moral binary, the anti-imperialists inadvertently reaffirmed the basis upon which neoconservatives and liberal internationalists seek to exercise imperial power. And this anti-imperialist Manichaean moral binary was, I guess, between the United States as an imperial power and whoever it was that the United States was having their military adventure with or upon.
Or more generally, whoever the United States is messing around with on the international scene, whether that's diplomatically, economically, or militarily. Although, of course, militarily is the one that everybody thinks about. And the reason I wrote the piece was largely to get people to think about moving the debate away from assessing the veracity of particular claims that are made about human rights abuses or, very unpleasant things happening in countries that are not aligned with the United States. And the reason I was critical of the way the debate often focuses on debunking, for example, some of the things that the Assad regime has done or the Iranian regime has done. The reason I was critical of that is that I think we should obviously try and debunk lies that are told in the mainstream media, but it's not always the case that the imperialists, when making a case against a country, are fabricating every single accusation. And if we primarily base our critiques of American imperialism on the basis of the fact that, well, if the Americans are saying bad things about this regime, those things must be lies, and therefore that regime must be good, we're debating on the same ground as the liberal interventionists and the neoconservatives, in that, well, if those accusations are proven true, if people are being tortured, if there are, very nasty things taking place in a country, if those are proven to be true, then what's the argument against some kind of quote unquote humanitarian intervention? So my critique isn't that we shouldn't debunk things, but that is a second order issue when it comes to opposing the American war machine. And I think there are better grounds than to put it crudely, shilling for quite indefensible regimes. There are better grounds to oppose American military intervention or diplomatic pressure or what have you. And I think those grounds, the first ground is a technocratic argument that American intervention doesn't work, makes things worse, et cetera, et cetera. But that's still debating on the ground of the interventionists, saying the problem with the intervention is not the intervention itself, but the fact that the United States will do it poorly. My argument is that it's really irrelevant whether or not the accusations against a particular regime are true or not, to whether we should oppose the American war machine. That is to say that our opposition should be rooted in an opposition to the military-industrial complex at home, which is fundamentally an amoral institution. And it's an institution that every time American power is exercised, it's deepening its control on American society. And, we could give the example of the Second World War, where, even those on the left, on the Marxist-Leninist left, the anti-imperialist left, might be in favor of America intervening in that war. But we have to understand what was the legacy of the Second World War for the United States. Well, after the end of the war, it's not like the military-industrial complex disappeared, but it became this huge institution that perpetuates itself in the United States. So the issue is less about whether or not the regimes that are being targeted by the United States are good guys or bad guys, or whether there are, let's say that theoretically you could conceive of a situation where the United States might be able to intervene militarily and alleviate human suffering. But that misses the point that every time you exercise that power, even if it's for, quote unquote, a good reason, you're further entrenching the power of the military-industrial complex at home, or more broadly, entrenching the power of the, quote unquote, progressive state, which uses imperialism not simply as a mechanism to extract resources. And in fact, in a lot of cases, I think people are missing the point when they focus on the extraction of resources. There are also internal reasons to promote a war, to transform society, to use it as an opportunity. If you look at the war on terror, if the Americans had just been interested in getting Iraq's oil, they probably could have bullied Saddam Hussein into giving them the oil. They certainly were able to bully Gaddafi into doing it at a certain point. The war on terror was not simply a war about extracting resources in a very crude sense, but is related to dynamics within American society as well. My argument was that we shouldn't focus on basically trying to defend the indefensible, because debunking things are important, but if we become kind of dogmatic in believing automatically that any accusation by the United States against a particular regime, or the media against a particular regime, assuming that's priori a lie, then when and if a more complicated picture comes out, I think it leads to political disorientation. People become disillusioned with left-wing politics, arguing that, people will only believe things that fit their priori beliefs about a particular country or a particular American intervention. Our opposition doesn't need to be based in that. It simply needs to be based in, we have to focus ourselves on fighting the military-industrial complex at home, and whatever arguments people are putting forward for some kind of intervention, we should oppose them dogmatically. But I think that's a more difficult thing for people to do, because if there are people suffering in the world and there's a case being made that American intervention could help, I think to a lot of normal people that's going to sound like a good idea. Whereas we should be talking about, let's say, a bigger issue, which is that sure, maybe this intervention, you could come up with some liberal grounds for supporting it. You could come up with some grounds saying that this intervention will be a successful one, unlike previous ones. But the problem is that's just feeding in to this ongoing war machine that we have, which doesn't really care that much about where the intervention is taking place. It's more interested in securing its contracts, securing, it's not some octopus with a kind of central command per se, but rather it's 1,001 different mini grifts by contractors trying to extract money from the US Treasury. So that's where we should be focusing our opposition and avoiding, to a certain degree, getting into these debates where people end up looking ridiculous because they're defending regimes which aren't necessarily defensible. We could, let's say, be opposed to the Iranian regime and say, people are protesting in Iran for good reasons. It isn't just a CIA plot. I think a lot of anti-imperialism ends up overestimating the competence and capability of the United States to execute successful foreign policy ventures, especially in parts of the world where the United States doesn't have long historical experience. So, we don't want to end up in a conspiracy theory where everything is a color revolution and everything is a Langley conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
But we can still say, like, sanctions on Iran don't help anything in the situation. Diplomatic escalation with Iran doesn't help with anything in the situation. And in fact, many of these regimes that are opposed to the United States themselves are in a kind of symbiotic relationship with the United States, in that opposition to the United States forms a basis for the Iranian military-industrial complex, which is a lot smaller than the United States' military-industrial complex, but within Iran is an extremely powerful institution. This is a global system of imperialism where you have hegemonic and counter-hegemonic powers, but those hegemonic and counter-hegemonic powers are, at the end of the day, capitalist powers. So we can say, look, we don't want the United States to escalate conflict with Iran, but that doesn't mean that people protesting in Iran are CIA stooges, or that the Iranian regime is somehow good or is going to pave the way to socialism. I mean, you see this with the multipolar debate, which, in my opinion, is really just a diversity, equity, and inclusion program for imperialism. It's like, let's have a more diverse set of imperial powers around the world. And instead, we should be focusing at home. And when we talk about foreign countries, we should try and learn about them rather than fitting them into our pre-existing narratives, and rather try and understand them on their own basis and the dynamics that shape those societies and what groups are in operation there, rather than trying to conjure from nothing this whole fantasy about East versus West, the global South versus the global North, and rather, refocus ourselves onto critiquing the military industrial complex, American imperial power on a kind of meta level that, if you want, I can use a metaphor, right? In Lord of the Rings, Frodo has to take the One Ring and he has to take it to Mount Doom to destroy it. And because it's terrible, it'll end the world, right? But on the way, Frodo does use the One Ring to hide from the Nazgul and things like that. But of course, every time he uses it, he falls deeper and deeper into falling under the influence of the One Ring. The American military war machine is like that One Ring. Even if it can be mobilized for good, as in the Second World War, every time it's mobilized, it drags us further and further down into a kind of state where we're subject to the military-industrial complex.
Well, let's walk through all that again. One thing that I want to go over is how your piece could be interpreted as a critique of Clinton doctrine. on Humanitarian Interventions,
Mhm.
which was formed during the Kosovo crisis in the 90s. And so it seems to start there. Like if we just reject the doctrine of humanitarian interventions, then we won't have to focus on these claims about war crimes or crimes
Mhm.
against humanity, or like for instance the gassing of the Syrian people, or whatever the claim might be, because we won't need to be countering a doctrine that would empower the United States to intervene on that basis. And there are lots of very straightforward reasons to reject the doctrine of humanitarian interventions, one of which is that it just is a violation of international law. It's like a way to justify.
Well, even the violation of international law is problematic because, if we base our position, for example, in a violation of international law, for example, people talk about the Iraq war being illegal, right? Well, if the UN had signed off on it, like they did with Gaddafi, would it have been any better, right? Does the fact that the international community, a community of capitalist states, decided to go all in on a particular country, does that make it legitimate? Well, of course, from the perspective of international law, it does. But for socialists opposing imperialism and capitalist powers, the legality of a particular U.S. intervention really is beside the point, because you have to ask a question: if the Iraq War had been signed off by the UN, would all the people opposing it have stopped opposing it? Should they have stopped opposing it? And I would say
I oppose the that and also the Desert Storm, which
Mhm.
was completely justified by, it was signed off on by the UN. But the question is, what does the law actually say about military conflicts and when an invasion or an action is justified? And then what is the basis that that the UN acts upon? Like, just as a parallel example, when the Supreme Court decided to stop the recount of votes in 2000, that was a legally, that was a legal act, but it was clearly not actually following the law, because it was, an incoherent decision made for political reasons, and that was transparently so. So we might look to the law as a guide to see, well, what is justifiable according to international law, and then to see the degree to which the UN doesn't follow its own rules. Perhaps what is the justification for a military intervention
like you said,
according to the UN's international law?
With Desert Storm, obviously.
Well, no. What I asked asking a question: what is the justification for military intervention according to international law?
I mean, there are cases, for example, when the UN Security Council has voted, there are provisions on the prevention of genocide, et cetera, that provide.
Okay, so those are like in line with.
I mean, you could make it
the humanitarian intervention doctrine.
There are, whether countries are complying with resolutions of the UN, and obviously the UN doesn't apply pressure equally. I mean, the justification for going into Iraq was that Iraq wasn't complying with the UN weapons inspectors. The United States went in anyway before there had been a authorization from the UN, but you could have conceived of a situation where it would have been justified under international law because Iraq was in violation of particular UN resolutions. There are other cases. For example, if a country invades another country, again, the UN can provide a basis for collective action, which is quote unquote legal under international law, right? But the legality of something under international law doesn't necessarily mean that it's something supportable. And again, I think that focusing on international law while it might be useful rhetorically to expose hypocrisy, for example, look, this country is violating these resolutions and no action is taken, but this country is violating resolutions and it gets all of these sanctions and military attacks on it. So, there's a rhetorical use for it. But again, the legality or illegality of a particular military action, according to international law, whether that's justified on humanitarian grounds. And I would note that neoconservatism isn't really that much difference. It's, neoconservatism, at least its public face, was a democratization project, right? Mm-hmm. So the legality of something, I think, is certainly worth discussing in terms of exposing the hypocrisy. But again, it shouldn't be what we root our opposition in, because even if everybody signs off on a particular military action, do we necessarily want to support it?
Right. I mean, it just seems to me that the one right, that the right of intervention, according to the UN, comes down to self-defense.
Yeah, self-defense. I mean, there's self-defense, and again, like the UN can pass resolutions, right? As it did.
Right, but I mean, according to the law, the UN, when they pass humanitarian interventions, the point is to intervene in an immediate way to create like conditions for peaceful negotiations, and not to justify an invasion or an occupation. I mean, none of those things could be justified by international law. The reason why I'm bringing up international law is not because I think it will work, but because if we don't have any recourse to any principles at all, we won't be able to determine what we actually want.
Well, the principle is not the principle is, as I put at the end of the article, is that we have a dogmatic opposition to the exercise of American military power overseas. And that can be quite a difficult thing to do, for at times.
So that would require the breakup of NATO.
Yeah, that, like, for example.
So, like, for instance, if England is invaded by France or by Iran or something, then the United States we would oppose the United States coming to the UK's aid to help fight back against the invasion. Yeah,
I mean, it's quite simple that, and again, that might be a difficult situation. Maybe the French Nazis are coming to, make everybody in England speak French and
eat croissants.
Eat croissants probably be an improvement on everybody's health. But, that's the emotional blackmail, right? That the military industrial complex will try and emotionally blackmail you into supporting it.
And would this apply just to the United States, or any nation would longer have? The left would oppose any nation's ability to use military force in defense of another nation, but only the left would hold the only time the military force can be justified is in defense of your own nation.
I mean, again, it might be understandable, but I mean, if you go back to the First World War,
right? I was thinking about the First World War, right? I mean, how all these treaties and assurances that different nations would back each other up in terms of a military conflict led to the First World War.
I mean, it didn't necessarily lead to it, but it led to its rapid expansion. It tied all these countries into networks of military solidarity, which ended up, leading to a bloody conflagration.
Mm-hmm.
And the socialist movement basically destroyed itself, but especially in Germany, where it rallied behind the Kaiser in the war credits, right? And for the Germans, when the war was happening, it was presented as a war of national defense against, France and Russia and encirclement, et cetera, et cetera. There will always be arguments that a war is defensive, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can argue the intervention into Afghanistan wasn't just America willy-nilly going and invading a country. It was in response to 9/11 and the fact that the people who did 9/11 were in Afghanistan. But
they weren't Afghan.
they weren't Afghan.
They weren't Afghan, and it wasn't done by the Taliban. And
no, it wasn't.
And there was no reason to think that the occupation of Afghanistan would stop another terrorist attack like the one on 9/11 from happening again, given that it was done by a network.
But you could make a plausible argument to the American public why that war was justified.
No, rhetorically you could justify it, but it was not justified on the grounds of self-defense, really. But it was certainly signed off on by the UN. So I do agree. I just wonder if we were to imagine that it was possible to support struggles for socialism around the world, would we want to apply the same standard around military intervention if it was in the name of socialism as we would now in the case of capitalist states that are going on?
I mean, maybe, but we don't have any socialist struggles that
no, we don't have any. That's all theoretical. Yeah,
it's largely theoretical. Like I have in the past, I defended the U.S. presence in Rojava on the grounds that it was protecting the Kurdish experiment there and stopping a kind of greater crisis, largely with another NATO member, Turkey, right? Mm-hmm. But I recognize that's kind of a very problematic position to hold, and it's one which I find difficult to defend to a certain degree. On some grounds it's defensible. I mean, at the very least, that is an example of a crisis where it's a crisis between two NATO members over a particular region. And so maybe maybe that's defensible, but it might be an inconsistency in my position. And maybe it's not defensible, and I'm willing to accept that. What I would, for example, like to see concretely in Syria is rather than the US, having an open-ended military intervention there, but, some kind of diplomatic, peaceful diplomatic disposition by the United States that, allows everybody to leave Syria. But I realize that's kind of a utopian fantasy. So, we don't really have any power to influence events overseas. And so,
because we don't have any power over our own state.
Yeah. So our primary objective is to, first of all, try and sort of weaken the hold of the progressive state. And that means attacking the military industrial complex. And that can be difficult with cases, if everybody opposing the US is a good guy and everybody, seeking the support of the US or getting supported of the US is a bad guy. That's like it's an easy way to look at the world, right? You don't have to think about the moral complexities of developments outside of the United States. I saw this with the Iranian protests, right? Mm-hmm. I went on Twitter the day that the news started really filtering out of Iran, and all the usual suspects, I'm not going to name names, but they all had their hot takes about this being a color revolution and being, the people on the streets who are protesting are CIA agents, so they deserve what they get, blah, 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 right? I think, because they have a very simplistic view of the world, and they don't really care to learn that much about the world. They have a preset view: America bad, everybody else opposing America is good. And I just don't think that's not going to be a very successful rhetorical tactic, right? Especially when people see, people are familiar with the complexities of particular societies. So my position would always be, it's like, maybe there's CIA intervention, maybe something is a color revolution, whatever, right? It's like, from our perspective, that's totally irrelevant. We're powerless to affect the world, as you said. And that's because we're powerless to affect our own state. And so our primary task is to, dismantle especially the coercive arm of the state, which is the United States military. And so it might be kind of more difficult to deal with, because you want to express solidarity with people protesting in Iran, but you also, at the same time, don't want to provide, cover or justification for military or diplomatic escalation with the United States. And that's a difficult position to be in, because you'll get hammered by both sides. On one side, you'll be called like you're buying the imperialist propaganda and the lies and you're a stooge. And on the other side, it's like you're just inhumane and you just want to let people suffer. And my position would be, it's like, well, I mean, let's do the trolley thing, right? Like the overall cost of the United States empire is very heavy on the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even if it might alleviate something in a very specific circumstance, let's look at the total. Let's not get bogged down in the details, and let's look at the overall impact of it. Its effect on American society, its effect on the American economy, its effect on the places around the world more generally, and say, look, we have to have this dogmatic opposition to American military intervention as far as possible. And that's a tough line to hold, right?
And I want to tell you a very simplistic story that I think was kind of took hold in like 91 after the collapse of the Soviet Union in America, on the right, maybe most of all, that, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were at the end of history. The liberal democracy was going to stride across the globe. And one of the ways it might have done that is by just absorbing as many nations as possible, or maybe eventually all of them, into NATO. Like we wouldn't have, without a need to, without an ideological enemy or division in the world, but only under U.S. hegemonic power, everyone would have been absorbed into NATO. NATO would have taken on a different character and purpose. In reality, what would have gone on is fair and equal trade between nations, working out of disagreements on a diplomatic and political level, democratic control over all of society and different nations. In the movie Network, there's a similar kind of utopian liberal vision put forward, like, the whole idea of nations and peoples is going to be put aside and everything will be managed by dollars.
This is just an old idea, right? This is the old liberal fantasy that, the free market, free trade world will lead to peaceful intercourse between nations, that the bourgeois revolution will sweep the world. You'll have, and the form of this bourgeois revolution will be national. There'll be different nations and different nation states, and those states will interact with each other peacefully. There'll be, progressive bodies. I mean, that's the philosophy behind the UN. That's the philosophy behind the League of Nations. Heck, that's
kid went to South Korea a few years ago. And he did that through an organization. The name of it is escaping me, but the whole purpose of the organization was to build bridges between nations, build mutual understanding, so that commerce and trade and war, commerce and trade could be supported and become the means in which we would avoid war in the future. It was a very
that's the liberal fantasy, because the problem is capitalism, right?
Right.
And the problem with our view of imperialism is basically derived from Hobson, mediated through Bukharin, mediated through Lenin, right? Which is a specific understanding of imperialism as synonymous with colonialism, and this very specific historical moment in the late 19th century where we have this rapid expansion of empires. But, if you go back to Marx, I've been reading Spencer Leonard's new book, and I think, this is an important point, that, war in capitalism isn't just about conquering and extracting resources from around the world. It is rooted in the kind of anarchy of international relations, but also in the dynamics inside a country and how nationalism and war is used to consolidate the power of the state. And we see this, historically. Why did Russia, one of the reasons Russia went to war with Japan in 1904, 1905 was this, idea of a short, victorious little war to try and, get the get the Russian regime back on track. Look at the Falklands War, right? What bloody use are the Falklands Islands? I know there's like maybe oil there now, but enormous amount of money spent on going to retake the Falklands Islands by Britain in 82. Well, what was the function? How did that play out, whether intentionally or not? Was the enhancing of the Thatcherite state, which helped secure a huge electoral victory for Margaret Thatcher in a period of deep economic crisis, and this war was a godsend for her in many ways. It's certainly, you could make a liberal justification for it, that there's a place called the Falklands Island. It's British. It's part of Britain. Argentina wants it, but the people on the island want to stay part of Britain. And so, based on the principle of national self-determination, Britain was well within its rights to retake that island. But the point is, what was the function of that military operation? Well, it was to further consolidate the Thatcherite state. Not the only reason, not necessarily the reason that's first and foremost in everybody's mind, but that's how it plays out. Right? That's how it ends up playing out. That every time again, go back to my area of specialization, the Middle East. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire could have sat back and let Europe murder itself. They could have sat back, got rid of all the treaties that sort of subjugated them to various like unfavorable international regimes. They did this, right? As soon as the war broke out, they abrogated the capitulations, which were basically ways in which foreigners, especially Europeans, could, interact with the Ottoman Empire without being subject to its legal system. It placed, these treaties placed limits on the Ottoman Empire's ability to raise its tariffs. There were treaties, all these kind of like unequal treaties. It could have sat back and done that, but the elites in that state saw the war as an opportunity, not simply for taking ground or resources, but for revolutionizing society and rebuilding society in the way that that the elite that took over in 1908 in the Ottoman Empire wanted to remake it. Right? War as, they were very much influenced by this German militarism, war as a vector for social transformation. So when we look at imperialism, I think, people are very much focused on this Leninist notion of imperialism, which I think is a legitimate way of talking about imperialism, right? Don't get me wrong. But I think it misses out other discourses around imperialism, particularly that deriving back to Marx, which talks about imperialism as part of this Bonapartist project about enhancing the power of the state and the executive over civil society and the parliament. I mean, just look at the American Civil War in that sense. I mean, obviously, we would support the American Civil War, but the outcome of that Civil War was a huge enhancement of the power of the American state. So, there are, it's a difficult one to contemplate, but when we look at military intervention, militarism, imperialism, we should look at the domestic things. And I think the right wing is actually often better at looking at the domestic aspect of imperialism than the right is, because the left is, because the left, we see in many sections of the left, the axis of class struggle has kind of been replaced by this core periphery notion that you have the core, the West, Western Marxism versus the East and the global South and the oppressed nations of the world, which in practice really ends up having people rally around
their states.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, if we talk about Russia today, right, the left-wing argument for supporting Russia is that, I mean, it assumes ridiculous proportions with people proclaiming Putin leading the socialist revolution, etc.
Yeah, I mean,
it's like some bonkers stuff. But the argument is that, whatever the nature of the Putin state, he's resisting American imperialism. And so we should be supportive of America, of Putin, that there are legitimate national security reasons why Russia went into Ukraine. And my point would be like, well, maybe there are, quote unquote legitimate or understand
national security reasons.
But
right?
why do I care? Why do I care about those? Take another example. Let's talk about Japan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was Imperial Japan wrong when it critiqued the Anglo-Saxon global order for not recognizing their sphere of influence in Manchuria, for having a racist international system, for operating racist colonial regimes across the region? It's not wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we saw what Japanese empire looked like, right? It was brutal and exploitative.
Right. Yeah.
So that the justifications may have been legitimate, but the ability of the Japanese state to lead an emancipatory sort of revolutionary war, it never could have happened because at the core of the Japanese state was this brutal militaristic armed forces that was driving policy. When we look at, for example, the conquest and colonization of Manchuria, there were not many, but there were elements on the left that initially supported the Manchurian project as a utopian project, as one in which that Japan would build a kind of multi-ethnic, multiracial state with all these different nationalities living together. That soon was obliterated by the fact that the underlying economic basis of Japanese rule in Manchuria was not this kind of emancipatory project, but was like a settler colonial / resource extractive political project. It's like people who endlessly debate, if Hitler had just worked with Ukrainian and Belarusian and Polish nationalists better, he could have successfully defeated Stalin. Well, that misses the entire point of what the German state was all about during the Second World War, right? Mm-hmm. So to believe that the United States military intervention, even if it justifies reasons, it's going to end well, it's like, well, look, what is the state that is doing this, right? It might have these like very humane, defensible reasons, but like, look at what it's going to devolve into. We saw that in Iraq, right? Mm-hmm. The opposition to the Iraq, if the Americans had been successful in turning Iraq into a democracy, would we have been against that, right? But
they could never do it. Happen. But that couldn't happen because what does that mean into a democracy, right?
Let's just say that you turn Iraq into some kind of liberal state where minority rights are guaranteed, people have like access to the ballot box, there's a vibrant civil society, people aren't getting executed on the street. If they created a stable democratic order in Iraq, that would have been a great thing. Right. But the point is,
the only way you can get to even the bourgeois democracy is through, I think, and this is my knee jerk, I'm not a political scientist, but it seems to me that the only way you can actually institute even a bourgeois democracy in a region is through the self-organization of the people of that region. You can't impose that from above, and you're never. The reason you can't is because you don't want them to have.
You don't want them to
control.
be. Yeah, you don't want them.
You can't have the rabble in the country be dictating to the big old U.S. state how things are going to run. That's not how that can happen. So the United States would always be in opposition to democratic movements.
It's whatever the rhetoric is, the nature of the imperial intervention. Now, you can make the case
not because the U.S. people would always be against the democratic.
No, it's not even because the U.S. state and members of that state individually are against that particular project. It's just that it's an unrealizable project for a variety of different.
Right, because the Bonapartist state can't lead revolutions for democracy, basically. The Bonapartist state arises when the revolutions fail.
Yeah, I mean, you can make
the right way to think about it.
I think the way I understand it is the Bonapartist state. It's to put it in modern terms, you end up with a kind of situation of gridlock, and the only way out of this gridlock is the Bonapartist state or revolution. And usually the Bonapartist state is the way that it goes. Now, you could make the argument that, well, there were examples after the Second World War where the United States at least facilitated, quote unquote, a liberal democratic transformation. But those were often in societies which already had a pretty developed civil society. Japan, or had progressed quite far in modernization. Japan, and.
Do you think it would have been possible in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union to do something like that?
I don't think the United States, I think there was a historical moment after the Second World War where you had the Soviet Union, you had this kind of competition, which basically forced the United States to rebuild its former enemies to allow them a certain degree of economic and political autonomy as part of this geopolitical struggle, right? But those conditions don't exist anymore. And the capacity of the American state doesn't exist anymore. Like, there was a historical moment where the United States...
we were so dominant after World War II, and there was an upswing economically, and there was the need of it was militarily advantageous to rebuild Japan. It would get provided.
And of course, this involved repression as well. The Great Reversal in Japan, the destruction of the labor movement, etc., all those kind of things. But that was also countered by the fact that, there was a kind of a progressive constitution established, a progressive state, a kind of liberalized progressive state with this is also important, with an economic basis to sustain it. Japan didn't fought the war for a co-prosperity sphere, lost, got nuked, only to have that co-prosperity sphere given to it by the United States within the context of the Cold War and the suppression of the Japanese left.
Yeah, by providing manufacturing for the military, and largely
by
U.S. military,
by opening its markets, by like the story of Japanese. You could talk to Deep State Cuba about Japan and Asia's economic miracle, or what have you. I mean, and you could even look at China in that way, right? China, Dengism, which everybody's into today, was facilitated by the American empire within the context of trying to defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War. You aggravate the Sino-Soviet split. You open up China to trade. You give them, you give them access. By the 80s, they're building factories, et cetera, They're integrated into the world capitalist system, and you're basically breaking up the Soviet bloc, right? So ironically, I think China's impressive economic growth is in part a result of American empire. And the problem that America has now, that it's treating China like a big Mexico when China is actually a big Japan, right? That now, it's too big for its boots, and the Cold War is over, et cetera, et cetera. So now America's panicking that, we've unleashed the dragon, as it were. And, the American bourgeoisie is schizophrenic because they all want access to the Japanese market, but again, even
Chinese market.
Yeah. And again, with the military industrial complex, whether or not they believe war with China is imminent, maybe they don't believe it, but it's a good excuse to extract money from the United States Treasury. It's a good excuse to enhance themselves. I mean, because what would the United States military do if there was a peaceful international order? I mean, then what's the justification for maintaining that military?
Well, I mean, in a way, we're kind of seeing it. But I tell you what, that's a good question to end the first half of this podcast on, and we'll take it from here for the second half. Is that okay? If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.